Welcome. I'm Sonni Efron, president of the National Press Foundation, and we're coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios in Washington, D.C. Today, we're talking trade, thanks to the generous support of our sponsor, the Heinrich Foundation. Today's program is about enforcement of the U.S. trade laws and regulations, how the U.S. enforces the rules that cover everything from counterfeit goods to palm oil and conflict diamonds to child labor in the supply chains, and what that will all mean for the U.S.-China relationship, for companies, and for human rights around the world. Our first guest is Brenda Smith, former Executive Assistant Commissioner for Trade at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the agency responsible for enforcing the trade rules. Well, what that means, that long title means, is that until last month, Brenda was one of the top trade enforcers in the U.S. government, and many of you journalists have quoted her in the past. She's going to explain how the U.S. government enforces the trade laws and what kind of enforcement policies we're likely to see going forward under the Biden administration. Our second guest is Stephen Lamar, President and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, who can talk to us about what companies are doing to keep their supply chains clean. Steve is also president of the Washington International Trade Association. And our third guest is Aleem Saitoff, who is director of the Uyghur Service of Radio Free Asia. And Aleem has been covering U.S. human rights policy toward Uyghur Muslims, including the recent declaration by the U.S. that China has committed genocide and crimes against humanity. Aleem also once worked in Xinjiang province, and he can share his insights. So please feel free to raise your Zoom hand or put your questions in the chat. We'll call on you. You do not need to wait to the end of the program to ask a question, and we will give priority to reporters on deadline. So with that, Brenda, let me turn it over to you, and thank you so much to all three of you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sonni. We're really pleased to be here today and appreciate all of the participants taking the time to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is the enforcement of international trade and the laws and regulations surrounding the flow of goods across borders. I believe really strongly in solid and effective trade enforcement because I think that without trust in the safety and security of goods, the United States, its citizens, its economy won't benefit from international trade. And that trust really comes from the effective enforcement of the agreements, the laws, and the regulations around trade, and gets us safety, the security of our goods, and a level playing field for U.S. businesses. So let's get down to the details. The U.S. sees over $4 trillion in trade every year, crossing our borders on ships, trucks, and airplanes, coming in 40-foot sea containers and small packages. Trade's important to ensuring that our factories can produce goods, businesses can satisfy consumer needs, and the public can maintain a certain quality of life. It's a key driver in U.S. economic prosperity, a source of jobs, and it drives innovation. But to ensure that the benefits accrue from trade, the U.S. government has put into place a framework that looks to translate policy goals like safety and prosperity into the rules of the road. There are actually over 500 U.S. laws and 50 different U.S. government agencies that regulate trade to ensure that goods are safe and secure and that U.S. domestic businesses aren't disadvantaged by that trade. Put more simply, when you buy something, for example, online, you expect that good to show up on your doorstep quickly, to be what it says it is, and to be safe for your use. In addition, U.S. businesses expect that if they develop a good product and sell it at a reasonable price, they'll be able to effectively compete in a global marketplace. But during the pandemic, many of our eyes have been opened around things we never really thought about before. In the trade environment, many consumers have seen the downside of global trade as masks or test kits that they've ordered through e-commerce platforms have turned out to be counterfeit, or that stories have hit the news about the terrible working conditions of workers involved in making surgical gloves. So what do we do about that? And what's kind of the backside of addressing these risks? Well, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which I worked at for nearly 30 years, is the primary agency charged with overseeing the flow of goods and people across our nation's borders. The agency's mission ranges from interdicting contraband, like illegal narcotics and firearms, to facilitating the flow of legitimate travelers and trade through over 300 ports of entry. A relatively small portion of the agency's 60,000 employees is dedicated full-time to handling cargo and collecting the $80 billion in duties associated with imports and exports. The agency's responsibility related to trade goes back to 1789, when the U.S. Customs Service was established by the Fifth Act of the First Congress. Its primary responsibility at that point was to collect the duties to allow the new nation to pay off the debts accrued during the Revolutionary War. Today, the agency works closely with partners like the Food and Drug Administration and the Consumer Product Safety Commission at the border to oversee the flow of goods into and out of the United States. CBP's law enforcement authorities are civil in nature, so the agency works very closely with Homeland Security investigations to pursue criminal cases. The Biden administration continues to highlight their commitment to free and fair trade, particularly with respect to the treatment and impact on workers and the environment. But what does that look like in the real world? So I've given you a lot of numbers: $4 trillion in annual trade, $80 billion in duties collected, 500 laws, 50 agencies. But I would summarize by saying it's a lot. So how does CBP do its job effectively? Well, the first thing that the agency focuses on is where is the greatest risk? The agency uses data to make good risk-based decisions, and it also uses technology as a force multiplier. So what does CBP believe are the areas of greatest risk? The agency has really developed its framework around what are known as priority trade issues, and there are 7 of those. But the highest profile ones really focus on import safety, the protection of intellectual property rights, the enforcement and administration of free trade agreements, the collection of revenue, and the effective administration and enforcement of anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders. Using these issues as a framework, the agency uses technology and data analytics to evaluate patterns of behavior, as well as identifying anomalies to figure out where a company or an individual who is producing goods or bringing them into the United States may be violating US law. CBP collects a great deal of information about each shipment that crosses our borders and assesses that data to see if there are connections with previously known bad actors, unexplained shifts in supply chains, or patterns that just don't make sense. When CBP finds a transaction or a business entity that doesn't make sense, the officers or commodity specialists may open the container to inspect the shipment. They can ask for additional information, or they can ask for additional documents. In cases of significant risk, a team may do an on-site visit, either foreign or domestic, or conduct an audit of the importer or customs broker. If CBP finds a problem, it can detain or seize the goods. It can require the full payment of duties. It can issue penalties or even suspend or debar a company from doing business with the federal government. Often, the public becomes aware of CBP's activity when a press release or a tweet is issued. For example, when CBP issues an indication of risk around the use of forced labor in supply chains, it issues what's known as a withhold release order. It may even issue a penalty if the behavior is egregious or longstanding. The agency also issues press releases often when there are significant seizures of counterfeit goods. You may have seen a conversation or the discussion of the significant seizures of counterfeit N95 masks or test kits during the pandemic. So where will the agency go in the future? Well, it is particularly interested in, again, making sure that the agreements that are currently in place or the laws and regulations that currently stand are effectively enforced. And so its activity around things like the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement is effectively enforced. It's working closely not only with the governments of Canada and Mexico to ensure that the provisions of that agreement are in place, but also that private sector companies that are looking to benefit from that agreement understand what those requirements are and are complying. The agency will also continue to, as long as the trade remedies are in place around things like steel and aluminum, or the China 301 trade remedies are in place, the agency will continue not only to collect the duties, but actively look for evasion of those trade remedies. It will continue to focus on e-commerce to make sure that counterfeit goods and other illicit substances aren't coming in through e-commerce supply chains. And it will also continue to be looking at and investigate allegations of the use of forced labor in supply chains. So it's got a broad set of challenges on its plate, very active, very varied. But I would look to see the Biden administration continue to draw on the operational and trade expertise of the agency and continue to drive towards thorough enforcement of the agreements, the laws, the regulations that the US already has in place to ensure that people trust what's coming through international trade supply chains. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions, Sonni.
Brenda, thanks for that fabulous overview. So I'm very interested with 500 different trade rules to enforce, this question of you focusing on the priority trade issues. You said you collect a lot of data. If it's not a secret, do you have algorithms that help you figure out what you're going to focus on? And are they a national security secret to what your algorithms come up with?
The agency for many years has had a system of targeting. Data has been collected electronically from US importers and customs brokers and US exporters for 30 years, 40, actually, because I'm dating myself, but 40 or 50 years. It was one of the first real mass automations was how to collect data on goods crossing our borders. And it's used that data to flag shipments of concern. Over time, the agency has really developed very good skills and expertise to be able to target. And certainly with the development of technology around artificial intelligence, particularly in the trade space, we've seen tremendous efforts around developing analytics to help use that data to identify both where the trends and patterns exist, as well as where the anomalies around what may be bad actors exist.
Okay. One more question before we move on to Steve. You talked about counterfeiting a little bit, and there are big e-commerce hubs in Memphis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis. Can you talk about how you think the enforcement will be going forward? Because as you said, all of this, so many goods that people used to get at the store have been ordered online now, and counterfeiting, I think almost everyone, many Americans have bought something, not just masks. I bought a webcam that turned out to be counterfeit by mistake. And I think it's a common problem. So what do you see as how do you think the Biden administration will step up enforcement, especially in these hubs?
CBP has been working counterfeit goods issues for a long time and is really used to working in the maritime and the truck environment, where you get container loads of counterfeit goods. With the rise of e-commerce, we've seen a shift from container loads into small packages, which really means CBP has to change its enforcement approach. The other thing that has to change is the availability of the information. We've talked a lot already this morning about the need to use data to target risk. In the small package environment, what you don't get is as much data or as rich a data. And so as a government, not only the United States, but other customs administrations have to figure out what the right data is so that it is able to facilitate legitimate e-commerce. But it can also make sure that consumers and businesses are making good decisions about risk when they order online. I don't know about you, but when I order, I look for, who's selling this to me? What country is it coming from? If I have a problem, who do I go back to? And so I think that information is something that we'll see the Biden administration and CBP really start to regulate and put in place to make sure that consumers and businesses and the government is able to identify where the risk is.
Okay, thanks so much. So, Steve, let me turn it over to you to talk about what's happening with the companies that are subject to this enforcement, and what are they trying to do to clean up their own supply chain so they don't get caught in Brenda's enforcement, CPB's enforcement network.
Well, thanks, Sonni, for having us on today. And let me also say, very strong agreement with everything Brenda said. We have a strong partnership with CBP, and while Brenda was at the agency, spent a lot of time working with her and her incredible team. And let me just take a moment, Brenda, to thank you for your service, and look forward to working with you in your new capacity, and the folks that are still at CBP and the capacity that they're in right now. I'll just give a little bit of an introduction about AFA to make sure everybody knows us. And you introduced me also as president of WIDA, so I'm really speaking in capacity with my AFA hat on as well, just to clarify that. So we're a trade association for the apparel and footwear industry and their suppliers. We have about 300 companies, about 1,000 brands. We represent about 4 million U.S. workers. A lot of people don't realize that the apparel and footwear industry, even though product is made largely offshore, there are so many activities that still occur in the United States that result in employment, high value employment as well. Things like design, quality control, compliance, which we're talking about right now. We're a very diverse organization. Our membership is made up of big companies, small companies, public, private, importers, exporters, manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, suppliers. We have apparel companies, shoe companies, accessories, inputs, and the services that feed into those supply chains. So really have a fairly large ecosystem of companies that are part of all these supply chains. We're deployed across three main pillars: brand protection, supply chain and manufacturing, and trade. And compliance and enforcement is a key part of each of those areas. And in some cases, that activity is kind of overlapping. So I'll just describe a couple of them. So in the area of brand protection, of course, you guys were just talking about efforts to prevent counterfeiting, anti-counterfeiting, making sure third-party marketplaces are making sure that they're not providing a conduit for counterfeits into the United States. So there's a lot of work that goes on there. Supply chain and manufacturing, that covers areas like social responsibility, product safety, chemical management, labeling, and again, a lot of enforcement and compliance activities that we'll be talking about are in that area. And then in trade, which is for us we've narrowly defined as customs and trade agreements, things like duties, rules of origin, anti-transshipment. Again, a lot of work that goes into making sure that companies are paying the duties, they're following the right rules of origin, they're following the rules that are laid out into the free trade agreements, and so forth. Our association spends a great deal of time educating members and their supply chains on compliance and enforcement activities. We've conducted dozens of compliance workshops on 5 continents now. Really trying to make sure that companies and then all of their supply chains and all the partners in those supply chains understand what the rules are. And this is an iterative process because the rules are constantly changing. The rules are constantly becoming better and smarter as they're responding to the various enforcement requirements. And we spend an awful lot of time sometimes in the local languages, making sure that everybody is equipped with all that information, all those tools and resources that they need to ensure that that they can make the right decisions. I'll leave you with two closing points, and then we can get into some questions. First, our association and industry have a long history of partnership with enforcement agencies. So you asked the question, what can we do to make sure that we're not sort of caught in the net? We're helping to build that net. We want to make sure that that enforcement is occurring, that it's robust, that it's very deliberative, that it's very smart. And this is really key to our success. We invest millions in making sure that our systems are compliant. We're teaching regulations and systems to our supply chain partners constantly. As I mentioned, often we do this in concert with the government agencies. And those compliance workshops that I mentioned before, these are the entities and the agencies that have spoken at those workshops. And I'm actually proud to note that Brenda's been a speaker a number of times over the years. But we've had CBP, the Federal Trade Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Department of Labor, Commerce, Department of Defense, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, U.S. Trade Representative, and many foreign governments. The enforcement agencies of foreign governments have appeared at our workshops as well, because part of that enforcement and that compliance occurs in conjunction with the foreign governments too. We think we're on the front lines of this, communicating these requirements, training on these requirements, retraining on the requirements. As I mentioned, it continues to kind of get updated when these changes occur, to make sure our supply chains are compliant. We don't win, and frankly, it's not fair if others are allowed to evade the law. So we're very insistent on making sure that these laws and these regulations are enforced. And second, we're constantly looking for ways to beef up that enforcement, to give it more resources, to make it smarter, to make it more effective, to make sure all the regulations and requirements are implementable and measurable, to make sure it's targeted so the bad actors feel the pain. Brenda was talking a little bit about trade facilitation and trade enforcement. And facilitation and enforcement are really two sides of the same coin. You want the bad actors to be caught in that enforcement net, and then you want the good actors, the trusted traders, you want their trade to be facilitated. So you really want to create a fairly big differential between those who obey the law and those who are insistent on evading the law. It's important that there is this partnership with trusted traders, but it's also it should be reinforced that this is a constant struggle. This is sort of an area of continuous improvement, continuous challenge. The bad actors, and they really come in all shapes and sizes. They can be counterfeiters, folks who want to cut corners on product safety, and those who are insistent on trafficking and forced labor. They're constantly looking for ways to evade the system, and they're very inventive. And so it's up to us to be equally creative and staying a couple of steps ahead of them. So let me stop there and let us get into further into the conversation. Look forward to taking any questions.
Okay, terrific. So anybody who wants to raise your hand, you can raise your Zoom hand, and we'll get you unmuted. You can also drop your question in the chat, and we will ask it. Steve, so let me turn for a minute to the topic of the day, Xinjiang cotton, which is, of course, big. As most of you know, Secretary of State Blinken has been outspoken about it. He was on Meet the Press on Sunday, and he made pretty wide-reaching comments saying basically we need to stop not just cotton, and Brenda mentioned tomatoes that have been coming from Xinjiang province, but that we have to look very broadly. The U.S. will be looking very broadly. Now, for the manufacturers who want to stay on the straight and narrow, want to make sure their supply chains are clean and free of forced labor, of course. The New York Times had a story this week that said essentially Xinjiang cotton is going to be really tough to police because we don't know where it's coming from, and it goes through all these different suppliers, and so it's going to be actually, even if you want to clean up your supply chain, it's going to be really hard to actually make sure that no Xinjiang cotton gets into the products that U.S. consumers are buying. Where are you guys at on that?
Well, our companies and our industry, we've got zero tolerance for forced labor. I mean, we have a moral and legal obligation to make sure that forced labor doesn't infect our supply chains. And this isn't the finished product. This is any of the inputs, any of the services that go into our supply chains. This is a constant, as I said, iterative effort to make sure that that these products, these inputs, are not making their way into the supply chain. And this is something that's been going on. This efforts to prevent forced labor from infecting our supply chain is something that our industry has been doing for decades. What happens is, as I mentioned before, is forced labor challenges continue to evolve and to grow, and so that our responses to that have to continue to evolve and grow. We're constantly pushing back further and further into our supply chains. So not just to the factories that make our products, but the factories that make the fabrics and yarns that go into those products, to the farms that grow the cotton, to the other supply chain partners that touch the inputs that ultimately make their way into a shirt or a pair of pants or a pair of shoes. And this is an effort to educate the supply chain partners, to train them, to make sure that they're following codes of conduct in terms of engagement, to validate that they're following those codes of conduct. When we discover problems, we fix them, we mitigate them. And when we can't mitigate them, to make sure that those problem areas don't make their way into our supply chains. And as I said, it is a area of constant effort, constant improvement, and constant activity.
But so you have China saying essentially there is no forced labor in Xinjiang. So it's not that the companies can rest assured that the government is a partner here. The government is saying there isn't a problem. This morning, I don't know about you all, our Twitter feed was blowing up with Chinese media denouncing the United States, saying that companies are going to have to choose between the U.S. and China. They can't do both, and essentially saying, no, we're not going to let you segregate Xinjiang from cotton or these certain products because there is no problem. So what happens to the companies? What do you see going forward? What advice do you give the companies, the brands like H&M and Nike and so many others that are kind of caught in the middle between the U.S. and China on this issue?
Well, there's a lot of credible evidence, a lot of credible information that there is forced labor, that it is widespread in the region. Acting on that information, customs and other governments have taken action, these withhold release orders that Brenda talked about, to prevent items that are made using resources from that region, and particularly cotton and cotton products and tomato products, from coming into the U.S. So the legal requirements, if you just kind of look at it just from that very narrow focus, is that you can't bring a product into the United States if it includes these inputs. You can't bring a product into other countries. You can't include it because it's been tainted, it's been infected with forced labor. If the Chinese feel differently, if they've got different information, and many have asked for them, I think the United Nations was the most recent, have said, let the world in to investigate and review and see firsthand, independent, non-attached observers to make independent observations to see if what you're telling folks is in fact true. And if that's the case, then that would be great news. But if they find that there is that evidence, again, that evidence that has been widely reported, and this is the information that customs and other government agencies have been acting on, then it's up to the Chinese to make sure that stops, because forced labor has no place in the 21st century.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Anybody who has questions, feel free to raise your hand. And Aleem, I'm going to turn this over to you. So China's saying there isn't a problem, choose, and we have no forced labor. So what do you think are the next steps here for American and other international companies that are trying to make sure that there isn't forced labor in the supply chain, with a partner that's saying there isn't a problem, and if you think there is, don't do business in China?
And thank you very much, Sonni, for having me on the panel. And at Radio Free Asia for the past 4 years, of course, we have been doing a lot of reporting on China's mass detention of Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic groups, million or two, even more. And we also covered a number of issues, including the forced labor issues. And China, of course, as Stephen stated, that trying to basically deny that there is no such a thing, while the UN, US governments asking for China to allow them to visit the region with unfettered access. But we see that's not happening. But in our reporting is initially in early 2017, the Chinese authorities suddenly changed its policies toward the Uyghurs and began mass detention of Uyghurs in all areas of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Then when 2018, the issue of mass detention became a global issue. When it was first raised at the UN about the mass detentions, Chinese government, of course, initially denied that there is such mass detention or such internment or concentration camps. But when this issue became a global issue, China then changed its tune, stating that, we do have the camps, but this is not like internment or concentration camps, but these are vocational training facilities, because these Uyghurs, they're influenced by so-called extremism. So we are bringing them into these facilities. They come in voluntarily. So we teach them about Chinese laws, and we teach them about Chinese language, and we also teach them skills. So at that time, when I started to change their narrative about these camps, what happened was the Chinese government, and especially Chinese companies, began to build factories, different kinds of factories, textile factories, glove factories, hair factories, whatnot, within the camp compounds right next to it, or just a mile or two nearby. And a lot of satellite images came out, could testify those. And also we did targeting reporting on this. For example, in Luo County, Hotan Prefecture, the Chinese government built a special industrial zone. Specifically, there were a number of Chinese companies set up to produce human hair. We did a thorough investigation and realized these hairs came from Uyghur detainees from the camps, because Uyghur women, it's Uyghur tradition, like many traditions, Uyghur women all have long hair. So all these hairs come from this Uyghur women, then come to this Chinese factories that's hiring thousands of people to process and produce the hair, ship to other parts of China, and then they export to the US, Europe, and other countries. And actually, Brenda, when she was the executive commissioner at CBP, they issued a withhold release order. And when the shipment came to the US port of entry, it was seized and confiscated. And also they forced Uyghur and other ethnic groups in the camp, and they forced them to also to produce PPEs, for example, right after the coronavirus became a pandemic. China also exported a lot of this PPEs to other countries, including UK. We know. So the forced labor issue is a very big issue. While China does its best to deny, but we know, and the international community know, that's a fact. And also at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, in March and April, even May of 2020, when the coronavirus began to spread all over, including the US, we see hundreds, thousands of young Uyghurs who are not detained. They were all transported, and shipped, if you will, to rest of Chinese provinces, to companies to work in a forced labor regiment. Because when we realize a lot of these Chinese companies, they basically advertise saying, we have 200 Uyghur women. Any company wants it, we can ship them. They'll be treated under like a military regiment, curfew kind of situations. And they will just work like 10, 12 hours a day. They did a lot of this kind of advertising, and a lot of Chinese companies also hire these Uyghurs. That's why we see forced labor is implicated, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. more than 80 global brands, including H&M, Nike, Adidas, that's in a big controversy now, and Apple, whatnot, all the other major companies are implicated with this as well. So when this company is now trying to kind of distance itself or cut off the forced labor implication, like Nike, Adidas, now H&M, and the Chinese government mobilized Chinese people to boycott and attack them. Of course, they are in a different situation. So forced labor is a very big component of China's policy of genocide and crimes against humanity that's ongoing against the Uyghur and local population there.
So, Aline, let me go back to what you said about there being Uyghur people being taken to factories in other parts of China. So it's hard, I presume, it's a huge country, how to track that, how to find that. What kind of reporting are journalists? I mean, journalists aren't allowed into Xinjiang or other places, and the restrictions on journalists, as you know, are more. And many journalists have been PNG'd and kicked out of China, including some speakers on this program earlier. Ling Wei from the Wall Street Journal, who spoke for us on this program not long ago, was kicked out of China. So it seems like the more reporters, China is basically saying to journalists, well, either you're going to sort of toe to the nationalist line. The BBC reporter was recently also kicked out. And you're not going to do investigations of things like forced labor, wherever it is, or we're going to make you leave. Where do you see the future? I mean, how effectively, without any outside enforcement, how can we know that forced labor isn't going on in supply chains?
Of course, that's part of China's denial strategy to kick out all the foreign reporters who are really interested in the Uyghur situation, genocide, forced labor, crimes against humanity, whatnot. And we see Chinese government increasingly hostile towards Western media covering on all of these issues. As you state, China basically kicked them out. Latest is a BBC reporter who covered extensively on the Uyghur issue because China is very scared. China doesn't want the international community to know what it is doing to the Uyghur people. China doesn't want crimes against humanity or genocide or forced labor situation to be reported widely. So that's why China is doing this. And as you stated, it's increasingly hard for Western journalists, even stationed in China, to report on the Uyghur situation. And it's very hard. And also the Chinese government renews their visa per year. So if they report on something about the Uyghurs, then Chinese government doesn't renew their visa, then they can't stay in China, they have to leave. And China obviously is a big country, big market for many American and international media. But that's the way China manipulates, try to at least, Western media. So force them to toe Chinese government line. And if they don't, they kick them out or even harass them, threaten them. For example, just 2 Australian reporters, they fled China just a few months ago because of the threats they faced from the Chinese government. That's how horrible now for Western reporters to report on China in general, on the Uyghurs specifically. And for Western journalists in the US, other countries to cover China remotely, of course, it's not very easy. It's not also very easy for us at Radio Free Asia to cover what is happening. Although we speak the language, of course, we know the area very well and the people and their mentality. So we do a lot of targeted calling, and that kind of helps us to find out a lot of information. But I think another good thing is for reporters to pay attention is the TikTok China produced, that's a Chinese app. Of course, US is trying to ban that, but a lot of things come onto TikTok. Some Uyghurs, very brave few Uyghurs, a lot of Han Chinese themselves in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They also produce a lot of videos that actually showcase what is happening locally. And also Chinese media, interestingly, because China is authoritarian, if not a totalitarian state. It's government propaganda. But even in their own media, in the Chinese media, especially reporting on the Uyghur situation, you could see sometimes they go so far, they even reveal a lot of things that they were trying to hide from the Chinese government. For example, recently, a top Chinese university just produced a big report. It was available online for a while until the international community paid attention. And Dr. Adrian Zenz, who is the expert on China's forced labor, he came out with the report based upon the Chinese government, Chinese university report, which basically stated their policy, the Chinese government should adopt a policy of thinning out the Uyghur population from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region by relocating the Uyghurs to mainland Chinese factories to work there in a regimented situation, so they cannot leave, go back home, or they have to stay there for probably the rest of their lives. At the same time, bring more Chinese settlers to replace them. That report itself also showcased that China is committing, forced labor against the Uyghur population. So these are some of the things I think the reporters can closely watch, and that they can find out a lot of useful things as well to basically to report. And also, a lot of Uyghurs who were able to flee China, some of them are camp survivors, some of them relatives of the camp survivors, or a lot of Uyghurs in exile, their loved ones since 2017, either completely lost communication with them, or their loved ones, mother, fathers, and wives, husbands, even children are separated from them, or detained in the camps, or sentenced by the Chinese government. So there is this huge resource that international journalists can also reach out to and interview these people to find out what's happening to the Uyghur people, and in spite of the Chinese government efforts to cover up whatever is happening.
Well, thanks so much, Aline. And let me turn this back for a minute. I'll throw this open to you, Steve and Brenda. We're talking a lot about trade enforcement, and the rap against the Trump administration was, they're picking on China because they want to have a U.S. trade war on China, and so all the enforcement and obviously there are very severe and well documented and horrific human rights abuses in China, but the idea that other countries are kind of particularly long time allegation that friends of the United States are not subject to the same sorts of enforcement mechanism. But Brenda, you were involved in a recent case on, I think it was you, or certainly CPB was, on gloves in Malaysia, a country that's friendly to the United States, certainly a country that the Biden administration and actually the Trump administration was seeking to have better ties, in fact, in part to counter Chinese influence in the region. And there was enforcement against the glove manufacturer in Malaysia. Can you talk about that? Is there, do you see the Biden administration being able to be even-handed and picking off enforcement even in countries that are friendly to the United States at a time when the United States is really trying hard to rebuild its alliances around the world, and the Biden administration feels that the Trump administration really frayed those relationships? It's doubling down and trying to rebuild them. Is there going to be pressure to go a little easy on friendly countries?
I think one of the things that both the Trump and the Biden administration recognize is that a whole of government approach on these issues is really important. So you see the communication, the messaging from Secretary of State. You rely on the technical expertise of the United States Trade Representative and the Department of Labor. You see the sanctions coming out of the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury. And that combined with messaging from all of those departments, as well as the enforcement activity from the Department of Homeland Security, I think are really important in sending a strong message. And Biden administration very clear that protection of labor, workers' rights, labor, fair labor practices really important to them as a policy goal. And so I think you'll continue to see that the broader but targeted use of different agency authorities to be able to find the right balance, but send a strong message about the protection and the importance of labor rights. In terms of the allies, working with different allies, we saw, so one of the things that was interesting to me over time was the fact that the U.S. authority to stop goods made with forced labor is unique around the world. It was implemented in the early 1930s, and for approximately 100 years, CBP, or the United States, has really gone it alone in terms of stopping goods to send the message to the business community that unfair labor is not acceptable. But just recently, really, with the development of the USMCA, we now have some really good partners. Canada and Mexico both now are required to implement a similar structure. We've gotten tremendous outreach from countries like the United Kingdom and Australia, where they have the Modern Slavery Acts, which have a different set of requirements. But I think what we're trying to do as an international community is triangulate on what is the most effective approach. Is it a system of customs controls or sanctions, or is it transparency and disclosure from the private sector, as is required by the Modern Slavery Acts? And I think the answer is it takes all of it. And so as the Biden administration proceeds to take action to ensure fair labor, I think what you're going to see is a mix of the various efforts: transparency, disclosure from the private sector, some of the efforts that Steve talked about, the continued investigation into their own supply chains. I think you're going to see leveraging consumers and what they care about and have information about. Alim referenced a great deal of information that's available out there. I think both governments as well as companies can keep an eye on that information to understand what situations are, as well as to take action to mitigate the risk in the supply chains.
If so much textile and apparel manufacturing takes place in South Asia and Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Bangladesh, how can CPB account for forced labor in finished goods coming from countries that source cotton and other inputs from China? And wouldn't it be necessary to have agreements with customs in those countries as well in order to monitor for inputs? Is that even possible?
That's a really good question, and frankly is one of the most significant challenges for Customs and Border Protection, as well as for the private sector, is to really understand from their source where the raw materials come from and what processes they are going through to result in finished goods that come to the United States. So let's use the Xinjiang cotton as an example. So the expectation under the law is that companies will know where their cotton is grown and which products it ends up in. And that may be a very convoluted supply chain that starts in a place like Xinjiang, goes through an intermediate process for thread or to be produced into fabric in China, and then go on to another country like Bangladesh or Vietnam to turn into a finished good, which is then shipped to the United States. So very complex supply chains. But the expectation is that companies will understand to what can be the fourth or fifth tier level of supply chains, will know where their products are coming from. So Customs and Border Protection has over a number of years had what are known as Customs Mutual Assistance Agreements, CMAAs, and they have 58 of these agreements with countries around the world, in which basically there is an agreement to work together as customs administrations to exchange information about enforcement concerns. And I believe that this could certainly fall under those agreements. There are also less formal agreements where the U.S. has developed really good relationships with countries like Malaysia, like Vietnam, where there is both a willingness to learn from each other, to share best practices, but also to show and to be transparent about the economic activity going on in their countries. And so we've been able to, as a government, use those relationships to really pursue the enforcement concerns that are raised in areas like forced labor or even anti-dumping and countervailing duty evasion.
And Sonni, if I can I just jump onto that for a second?
Please.
So one of the things that was going to be an important pickup for the Trans-Pacific Partnership is there was a whole variety of customs cooperation mechanisms. You know, Brenda talked about the USMCA and the new anti-forced labor mechanisms that have been renegotiated as part of that. But that sits on top of very strong customs cooperation language that had existed and was strengthened even in the USMCA between these three countries. With the TPP, we're actually envisioning taking that approach and really building that into customs cooperation opportunity between the United States and all of those countries. Again, writing the rules of the road, as Brenda talked about. And when we discontinued our participation in the TPP, we lost the direct opportunity to do that. Now, Brenda did talk about some of the customs cooperation opportunities that have kind of grown up since then, and I think that's important work. But I think we shouldn't forget that we really lost a really good opportunity 5 years ago, to really formalize and regionalize this customs enforcement strategy.
Marilee, can you hear us? Because I wanted to give you the floor.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead.
So Brenda, I wanted to ask, would CBP be willing or able to release the manufacturer ID codes for goods that are subject to a WRO to help importers comply with that WRO? And if you think that they would not release, what is the barrier to doing so?
So great question, Mara, because I think it goes really to the heart of the transparency and disclosure that I talked about a few minutes ago. In many cases, when CBP issues a withhold release order, it does provide pretty specific information about who the manufacturer or the grower is that's involved in that particular supply chain. You see that with many of the WROs that have been issued in the last couple of years. When the agency issues a withhold release order that is broader in nature, maybe regional based or country based, then you start to run into these issues of exactly who is involved and which manufacturers or which growers is CBP actually concerned about, because clearly that would be useful information if a U.S. importer is trying to not do business with that particular manufacturer. The challenge is around the Trade Secrets Act and the privacy requirements that the government has to operate under. The CBP receives a lot of business confidential information. All of that information that I talked about related to the transactions as they cross borders is covered by the confidentiality requirements of the Trade Secrets Act. And so it is a real challenge to understand without additional statutory protection how CBP can. In fact, at this point, they're really precluded from releasing that information. I think we have an opportunity as a community really to have the conversations and to come to consensus around what should the level of information sharing be. As you know, congressional stakeholders, as the administration looks at what is the art of the possible with respect to these labor statutes. I mentioned that the forced labor statute is nearly 100 years old at this point, and the regulations that implement those statutes are nearly 60 years old. And I think it really is time for the government, the U.S. government, to look at how is it that we regulate forced labor. And one of the key aspects has to be, and how do we best share information and ensure that that a public allegation of forced labor is adjudicated correctly, but also that it's not a gotcha mode for the private sector, that those companies that really want to do the right thing have access to the right information and can have an opportunity to mitigate that risk in a fairly urgent way that protects those workers.
So let me see if I understand, because I'm not sure I do. For instance, when we had the hair WRO, that was a specific company that was identified. So people knew if that company was on their invoice not to import anymore. When you have the region-wide cotton from Xinjiang, why is the name of a specific company that produced textiles or garments secret when the name of the company that made hair is not secret? Is it because the final manufacturing was not that original company, that company was a supplier to the final manufacturer? Is that where the problem comes in?
So what I would tell you, so first of all, I am not a lawyer and I don't even play one on television. So take my explanation with a pretty big grain of salt. But the statute and the regulations around the forced labor authority that Customs and Border Protection has gives CBP the ability to share information when it's specific. They have to meet a legal standard of reasonable suspicion, and they can share that particular piece of information during the issuance of a withhold release order. They can also share specific information when the enforcement action, the seizure, the exclusion itself, a finding is complete. And unfortunately, in the customs world, the completion of an enforcement action takes some time. It eventually comes, and that information can be shared at that point. But when you are adjudicating a broad withhold release order that may involve many companies or business entities, because the adjudication is not complete, and the legal decision has not been made yet, it's at that point that CBP is precluded from sharing the information. Does that help?
Okay, any other questions out there? You can raise your hands. Brenda, I've got one for you. You mentioned technology in your opening remarks. You mentioned and Steve, you mentioned this earlier before this show, this use of technology to try to pin down these intangibles. So we have barcodes, we have microchips, we have genetic analysis of all these things. Can you talk about the use of technology in a more targeted way to address these issues, whether it's public or private? What can you chip and specify, and what, like a tomato, what are you going to do with a tomato? Can you talk about where technology could be better deployed? And Steve, I'm sure your members are working on this as well. Where could technology help, and where can it not help?
So maybe if I can start and then turn it over to Steve. CBP has used technology to facilitate the flow of legitimate goods and to identify where things aren't as they should be for a long time. For example, at our ports of entry, we have a number of large-scale X-rays, which you can literally drive a truck through, that can show you what's inside a truck. And if it's not what it says it is, CBP then stops that truck. But that means you don't have to unload each and every truck. You can actually take a picture of it. So CBP is very innovative and very open to using technology. From my perspective, the useful technology in this realm really falls into two buckets. The first bucket is technology that helps identify the origin of the good. And the government has used DNA-like testing for years to say that this natural product has a signature, a combination of chemicals, a combination of sorry, I'm not a scientist either. that matches the same signature as a sample from a particular area. And we've gotten really good at that. You can use pollen to link that. You can use chemicals. You can use all kinds of things to test the origin of a specific good. And so if you think about that white cotton t-shirt that we talked about earlier, you can actually test that white cotton t-shirt to say that the chemical signature matches a sample that we have from a place like Xinjiang, or it doesn't. There's two challenges. One is cost. So can you get the cost of testing down to a reasonable level that it makes sure to do it? The other thing is time. So in an ideal world, at a customs port of entry, you would be able to test that and get an immediate answer within 20 or 30 seconds. If you have to hold that container or that package of goods for any amount of time, that means you need to store it, you've got space, it sits in front of other trucks, other shipments, other containers. And so from a CBP perspective, you've got to have something that you can test that's fast and cheap. An alternative technology is data. So an automated system that will collect the data. CBP has shifted in recent years from a mainframe based system that collects that information now to a cloud-based single window, which is very flexible, very agile, and many government agencies are able to use that data. But if we think about the opportunities of a technology like a blockchain, where you can collect information literally in a field and tag a pallet load of tomatoes that was grown in a field, let's say in Mexico. As it goes through the process, information can be collected at every single point through a barcode or through something called a GTIN, a global trade identification number, that will give you information about the origin of that shipment. And then when it arrives with CBP, CBP can say, yes, there's a risk it came from a field in Xinjiang versus a field in Mexico. And so that's something that investments could be made that would really help make better risk-based decisions.
Yeah, I would.
Companies afford it?
Well, I would agree with everything Brenda mentioned, including cost and time. I mean, great technologies exist and are being pioneered all the time, but are they scalable? Are they able to be used across the supply chain by everybody, right? And when you talk about cotton, which is an extraordinarily fungible commodity, I mean, you're not necessarily looking at the cut and sew operations. You're talking about the farm, or you're talking about what happened in the ginning process, where you might have cotton from 4 different places, including cotton that's suspected of being forced labor, plus cotton that is not suspected of being forced labor. But if all that gets commingled together, then the resulting product now is tainted with that forced labor, right? So if you're trying to trace the clean cotton into the ginning process, and then the resulting yarns or threads that are coming out, or the fibers, are you able to establish a linkage between the clean cotton that came in and the fiber that came out? Okay, and that's what technology is hopefully going to be able to help us do that. And again, the other point is, so it's not only technology that's tracking it, but technology at the end point can tell us can validate whether or not that's going on. Technology that can, if a product is stopped, we can hit the button and we can quickly provide Brenda's former colleagues the exact information they're looking for on a very timely basis, so they can make that decision if they need to make that decision. And the thing that about technology, and we're the last year and a half, I think for all of us, we've seen the way in which technology has really been changed the way in which we do things. Is that technology is going to be changing the way supply chains interact. And that's going to be, I think, not only one of the legacies of COVID, but one of the legacies of all the supply chain work is the way in which these supply chains are going to become much more technology enabled, digitally enabled. And this is an area of continuous improvement again, making sure that it's practical, making sure that it's scalable, making sure that the costs come down, making sure that it gets used the right way. These are all the things that have to be answered in order for that smart enforcement to occur. And by the way, there's also, out of this area, but you look at all of the other enforcement areas, technology is hugely important. Having the right technology to make sure that counterfeits don't show up on websites, and be able to take those counterfeits down if they do show up. I mean, that's another area where where technology is going to be really important in our collective and shared enforcement activities.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you so much. This program is being recorded. We will post it along with resources helpfully provided by our speakers and journalists, some very handy websites that you can use for tracking what CPB is up to and other government agencies. And I want to thank each of you very, very much for making time and for being terrific sources. And that's it for us. We will see you again soon in our ongoing program on international trade for journalists. Thank you so much.